Learning to listen. Active imagination is, more than anything, a process of listening. Not all dialogue or interaction with your inner persons will be through words. There are sessions of active imagination in which the entire experience takes place through actions, through seeing and doing. It is still a dialogue, but a dialogue without words. More often than not, however, there will be spoken dialogue. In either case, we have to learn to listen. Often, we have only experienced these parts of ourselves who come up as images in our imagination, as enemies, as carriers of slothful resistance, neurosis, unproductive vices, immaturity. That is how they look to the ego. But now, if we are going to set up an exchange in place of the habitual lifelong war we have fought, we have to begin to listen. After so many years of ignoring these parts of ourselves, seeing them as in the inferior characteristics in our personalities, we find that they have some very unpleasant things to tell us when we finally listen. It is no surprise that some inner person tells me what a tyrant I have been over the years, how I have shoved my ego's attitudes down the throat of the unconscious. One must be willing to say, "Who are you? What do you have to say?" I will listen to you. You may have the floor for this entire hour if you want. You may use any language you want. I am here to listen. This requires a formidable realignment of attitude for most of us. If there is something in yourself that you see as weakness, a defect, a terrible obstruction to a productive life, you nevertheless have to stop approaching that part of yourself as the bad guy. For once, during active imagination, you must try to listen to that inferior being, as though he or she were the voice of wisdom. If our depression or weakness come to us in personified form, we need to honor those characteristics as a part of total self. It is awesome and frightening to take your sense of inferiority, guilt, or remorse, put that part of you in the witness box and say, "You have every privilege. You are the one who bears witness to that which I neither know nor understand." You may say whatever you wish, at whatever length. You will be respected and honored, and what you say will be recorded. But it is from these that the true power of active imagination rises. We learn to listen to the ones whom we have kept mute. We learn to honor those whom we have dishonored. Learning to reply. When we have learned to listen, we must also learn to reply, to contribute our own information, viewpoint, and values. When people first learn to honor the voice of the unconscious and to take it seriously, there is often a tendency to go overboard and decide that this ego knows nothing. There is a tendency to take everything the inner figure says as the final authority. This would be just a foolish and one-sided, as our previous ego-centered approach. Just as the ego needs to balance its viewpoints by going to the unconscious, so also does the unconscious need to be balanced by the attitude of the conscious mind. Remember Jung's observation. He said that the ego's relationship to the huge unconscious is like that of a tiny cork floating in the ocean. We often feel like that. We feel like a cork that is being tossed about in the ocean of life, completely at the mercy of the waves and storms that push and pull us. We seem to have a little control or power over anything. Jung contributed his analogy with a startling thing. The cork is nevertheless morally equal to the ocean, because it has the power of consciousness. Although the ego is small, it has its peculiar power of awareness, that we call consciousness, and that special concentrated power gives it a position that is necessary, as strong and as valuable as the seemingly infinite richness of the unconscious. The little cork can talk back to the ocean and has a viewpoint to contribute, one without which the evolution of consciousness cannot proceed. The ego can talk back, and this makes the dialogue one between equals. The ego's capacity for consciousness gives it the power, the right, and even the duty to wrestle with the great unconscious on equal terms, and to go work out a synthesis of values. Not manipulating. One of the most important laws of this second step in active imagination is that you never work with a prepared script. You don't know what is going to happen until it happens. You may know how you feel about something. You may know that you have to say to the inner person. You may know who you are looking for when you go into your imagination. But you don't know what the other person is going to say until he or she says it. You don't know what the inner people are going to do until they do it. You have the right to call out your anima, your animus, or your shadow figures, but you don't have the right to plan what they're going to say. And you don't have the right to dominate them once they appear. At its best, active imagination is life with surprises, a life that is given over to the unexpected. We make no plan or script. We simply begin and then let come what will. Whatever flows spontaneously out of the unconscious, without manipulation, without guidance or control, is the stuff of active imagination. We need to grasp this clearly, because there are now so many systems around that can be confused with active imagination, but are completely distinct from it. The main difference is that they work with a prepared script. Everything is determined in advance. These systems are sometimes called guided imagery, creative imagery, or by something else. What they all have in common is that everything is predetermined. You decide in advance what is going to happen in your imagination. The ego decides what it is trying to get out of the unconscious and prepares a script. The idea is to program the unconscious so that it will do what the ego wants it to do. In one system, the whole about purpose of using the imagery is to get what you want. You close your eyes and visualize the new car or the new job or the house in the country that you want. And you use the power of visualization to get these things. In another system, you attempt to have a better attitude about yourself by using self-imagery. You visualize yourself as you would like to be: slender, attractive, effective, efficient, or whatever. By the use of self-imagery, one attempts to become the idealized person that the ego has decided it would like to be. The problem with these approaches to imagery is that it is the ego that does all the deciding. The unconscious is seen as a sort of stupid animal that has no viewpoint of its own, no wisdom to contribute. The whole point of the exchange is to train the unconscious to do what the ego wants. The ego's decision may seem to be good ones. The problem is that the unconscious is not consulted in making them. Active imagination starts out from a completely different idea about the unconscious. We affirm that the unconscious has its own wisdom, its own viewpoints, and that they are often as balanced and as realistic as those of the ego mind. The purpose of active imagination is not to program the unconscious, but to listen to the unconscious. And if you do listen, the unconscious in turn will listen to you. If you have decided that you want to accomplish some big project and you find that the unconscious is setting up resistance against it, you should not react by trying to program the unconscious to agree with your ideas. Instead, you should go to the unconscious and find the one who is causing the paralysis, the resistance, or the depression, and find out why. If you do this, you are often surprised to find that the unconscious has very good reasons for disagreeing with your project or your goals. Perhaps you are about to go off on a big inflation or obsession, trying to achieve something that is actually impossible. Your conscious is likely to resist and try to bring you to your senses so that you scale down your project to something that is within your resources and capacities. Or your plans may mean doing permanent damage to your family life, your marriage, relationships, or friendships. The unconscious may send you physical symptoms, a feeling of depression or paralysis, in order to prevent you from going off on a tangent that would destroy something vital in your life. Active imagination begins with the principle that you must respect the unconscious and realize that it has something valuable to contribute. Therefore, the dialogue must be one between two intelligent equals who respect each other. It can be a case of one trying to program the other. This is why, in active imagination, there is no script. You don't follow a planned course. You don't put words in the mouth of those you meet. You don't decide in advance what the goal is. You don't set up a purpose and then try to manipulate the unconscious into doing along with it. Historically, there are some legitimate and fine uses that have been made of guided imagery. One example is the Greater Exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. This is a series of meditations on the life of Christ that uses a prescribed guided visualization each day. Jung gave a series of lectures years ago in Switzerland in which he used the great exercises to show the differences between active imagination and guided imagery at its best. In this guided imagery, you go, for example, to the Via Dolorosa. It is the day of the crucifixion, and you are there, present in your imagination. You smell the dust, sweat, and blood. You hear the jeering of the crowd. You see the crown of thorns, the cross, the blood flowing. You feel the sharp stones beneath your feet. The sun beating down on you as you move with the crowd toward Golgotha. In this way, for those who adopted Loyola's meditation, the events of the life of Christ were made so vivid, smelling, feeling, touching, hearing, that they became actual, immediate experience. This sort of guided imagery is good if it truly serves your religious purposes. It was geared mainly to the medical mentality, but much of that mentality still lives in us, and we can honor it. But Jung said it would be better for us if we could go in active imagination, walk our own Via Dolorosa, and find out that what is there within our own individual selves. It would not be predetermined by anyone or anything except the reality of what lives inside us. It would not be prescribed by authority or tradition. You might find yourself walking on the stones of an ancient way, as did Loyola, or you might find yourself walking at the deck of a yacht, if that is where your inner path leads. One thing you can be sure, ultimately every road is Via Dolorosa, for it leads us onto the issues and conflicts that every person must pass through, sometimes painfully and with heroic spirit, sometimes with sacrifice, in order to be initiated into the realm of consciousness. If you have a modern mentality, you must find your own path, go your own way, which is both terrifying and exhilarating. No one can tell you any longer the way, because there is no longer one prescribed way, but only a way, your way, which is valid as any other as long as you live it honestly. Much of the artificial loneliness of your life will evaporate if you realize that your way is merely a way, one way among many, yet unique and distinct from all others, springing from your own nature, a way that is inborn, not made, and waits to be discovered. For each of us, that path is a solitary one, for ultimately we must walk it alone. No one else can tell us which final direction it should take, and no one else can walk it for us. If you will walk in this way, active imagination is your proper path. Step 3. The values. So far, we have seen how to invite the figures from the unconscious and how to enter into dialogue with them. But this is not enough. We must also take an ethical stance. It is our job as conscious human beings to introduce the ethical element into proceedings. Once the imaginative process is launched, once the primordial and structural forces are invited to come up to the surface and be heard, some limits have to be set. It is the conscious ego, guided by a sense of ethics, that must set limits in order to protect the imaginative process from becoming inhuman or destructive or going off into extremes. Jung took the audacious point of view that humanity holds a specific role in creation, to contribute the act of consciousness and the point of view of morality in its highest sense. We are surrounded by a universe that is awesome and beautiful, but its forces behave in a way that is immoral. They are not concerned, as we are, with the specifically human values of justice, fairness, protection of the defenseless, service to our fellow humans, the keeping intact of the fabric of practical life. It is we who have to introduce these values into the world around us, and since the creatures who arise in our active imagination are often, for all practical purposes, personification of the impersonal forces of nature, it is we who must bring the ethical, humane and practical elements into active imagination. Jung also observed that there is no development of consciousness in the human sense without ethical conflict. Consciousness always involves ethical confrontations. We become aware of the conflicting values, attitudes, and paths of conduct that are open to us, and find that we must make moral choices. All these principles find their way into active imagination. As the inner figures present themselves, as the different attitudes and possibilities rise to the surface, inevitably we have to take an ethical stance in order to strike a balance among the conflicting values. It is equally a grave mistake to think that it is enough to gain some understanding of the images and that knowledge can here make a halt. Insight into them must be converted into an ethical obligation. Not to do so is to fall prey to the power principle. And this produces dangerous effects which are destructive not only to others, but even to the knower. The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man. Failure to understand them, or a shirking of ethical responsibility, deprives him of his wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness of his life. Quote by Jung, Memories, Dreams, Recollections, page 192. Jung told of a young man who dreamed that his girlfriend slid into an icy lake and was drowning beneath the water. Jung said, in effect, that the man could not just sit and let the cold forces of fate kill the inner feminine. He advised the man to go into active imagination, get something to pull her out of the water, build a fire for her, get some dry clothes for her, and save her life. This is the ethical, moral, and human thing to do. It is a much the ego's duty to bring this sense of responsibility to the creatures of the inner world, and it is for us to tend to the welfare of our fellow humans in the outside world. It is the health of our own inner selves that is at stake. I recall a case in which an inner archetypal figure demanded absolute control over a woman's life, at the expense of her feminine nature. The woman was doing analysis with me, and her active imagination was mostly with a very powerful and wise masculine figure. He gave her good information, excellent insight, but he also tried to argue her out of some of her basic instincts as a woman. He was trying to take over more and more of her life, at the expense of her essential character. One day, she was doing active imagination, and he suddenly said to her, "Give me your purse and your keys. From now on, I am taking over." In her imagination, she did what she was told. She turned over her purse and her keys. As she read this episode to me, I jumped to my feet. No way will you give him your purse and your keys. That symbolizes all your resources and complete control of your life. If you do that, you will abdicate your rightful role and turn your entire consciousness over to only one part of yourself. You can't do that. No matter how wise or right he seems to be. Only you can run your own life. You can turn that role over anyone else. Now you have to do it over again. Go back and tell him that you are taking your purse and keys back. Tell him that you will listen to him, respect him, and consider what he says. But you cannot turn your whole life over to him. Tell him that you need to think for your own self, and make your own decisions. After my outburst, the woman did as I advised. She went back in active imagination and explained things to this powerful masculine figure. He understood the principle, he agreed, and he immediately gave her back the purse and keys. Unfortunately, about a year later, after she had stopped analysis, this woman did turn herself over completely to her power drive. She let the power aspect of this masculine presence take over completely in her inner mind, in her inner world. She went off on an inflation. She became a know-it-all, lectured everyone, and tried to dominate every situation. This is an example of what happens when you allow yourself to go off on an inflation, be possessed by an archetype, and lose the independent position of your ego. How is making this choice an ethical problem? Whenever you allow one part of you take over and subjugate all your other instincts and values, it is inherently destructive. Inevitably, your conduct and your treatment of other people will be off balance. Our word ethics and our concept of ethical behavior is derived from the Greek word that meant proper conduct. It is instructive that this word was in turn derived from the Greek ethos, meaning the essential character or spirit of a person or people. Ethics, therefore, in its deepest sense, means the personal standard of conduct that accords with an individual's true inner character. Ethics is a principle of unity and consistency. People who behave ethically are those who make an honest effort to confront their behavior to their values, conform their behavior to their values. If one's conduct is grossly at odds with one's essential character, it always reflects a fragmentation of the personality. As Jung said, a shirking of ethical responsibility deprives him of his wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness in his life. From what we have said so far, we can summarize 3 specific elements involved in preserving the ethical aspect of active imagination. First, you add the ethical element by holding out for the attitudes and conduct that are consistent with your character and your deepest values. Second, ethical balance requires that we not let one archetype or one part of ourselves take over at the expense of the others. We can sacrifice essential values in order to pursue a narrow urge or goal. Third, we must nurture and preserve the specifically human values that serve human life, that keep practical daily life going, and that keep our human relationship alive. The great powers of the collective unconscious are so overpowering that we can be suddenly swept away by a flood of primitive energy that seizes the conscious mind. An energy that races toward its instinction goal, needless of the effect that it may have on ordinary human life or on the people around you. Inevitably, a powerful figure will appear in your active imagination and constellate this raw power drive. It may advise you in the strongest terms to drop all scruples that stand in the way of getting what you want, to drop the commitments and responsibilities that hold you down. These ideas usually produce a dramatic fantasy of asserting yourself, taking control of the situation where you work, having your own way with your family or friends, making everyone dance to your tune in one way or another. When this sort of fantasy gets going, you become convinced that you are going to resolve all your conflicts, settle everything, by simply laying down the law with everyone around you, telling of those who have stood in your way or opposed you, and doing exactly what you want. These extremes are so extractive because there is some truth, a partial truth in them. We all have areas where we have been weak, where we've failed to take a stand, both with ourselves and with the people around us. We have been weak-willed, we have been pushed around by our own compulsions, bogged down in the usual contradictions of life. It is not surprising that we get a clarion call from the unconscious, summoning us to the opposite extreme. We are seized by a fantasy of what it would be like to solve everything with a pure, clear act of power and will. But if we take this message literally and try to act it out in its raw, unresolved form, we are led to behave like Atia the Han. We leave a path of destruction behind us. It is exactly at this point that your sense of ethical values must be brought into the equation. Otherwise, you would go to a destructive, ultimately self-destructive extreme. Your life would be turned into a desert, bereft of human values or human relationship. It becomes the crucial task of the ego to answer back, to speak up for human values like fairness and commitment. The ego must ask, what effect will this extreme, otherworldly doctrine have on my everyday life? The ego must find a way to gentle and humanize these impersonal forces of the unconscious with their overwhelming, sometimes inhuman nature. If an attitude comes roaring out of your unconscious that will destroy your practical existence, hurt your relationship with your family, cause trouble for you and your job, or get you into power struggles with everyone, then you have both the duty and the right answer back. To present the ethical alternative, you can say, look, there are some human values that are very important to me. I am not going to give them up. I will not give up the love and relatedness that I have with my family and friends. I do not want to pursue some idealized goals to the exclusion of everyone and everything else. We have already learned that this must be a dialogue of equals. This means that we must not only honor the archetypes who speak to us in active imagination, but we must also consider ourselves to be equal to them, morally speaking, and therefore able to take an ethical stance. To speak back, assume a position, make it a true dialogue. We must neither seek to dominate nor allow ourselves to be dominated. The critical need for an ethical sense is at the ego level, arises from the nature of the unconscious itself. In a certain sense, the unconscious is amoral, in that it is concerned with living out and expressing the powerful, impersonal leitmotifs of the psychic universe. Every archetype, every power within the collective unconscious is morally neutral, like the other forces of nature. By itself, it cannot put moral or ethical limits on what it does or what it demands. Only human consciousness can take into consideration other values that should be preserved, limits that must be put on the inner demand, or this inner voice so that a balance is struck and life is served rather than diminished. The archetypes burst into consciousness with all this pent-up instinctual power of the primordial jungle. And like wild animals in nature, they can have little concern with human ideas of fairness, justice, or morality. They serve a realm that is close to the instincts. They are concerned that nature be served, that evolution take place, that all archetypal themes to be incarnated into human life. But how that takes place, how much damage it might do, and what other values might be trampled on in the process. With these things, the raw, primitive archetypes do not know how to be concerned. The primordial archetypes can be compared to lions in the jungle. When we look at them in their wild splendor, they appear as walking incarnations of nobility, but they also are impersonal forces of nature, each a law unto itself. Following nature's impersonal and amoral laws, unqualified by human considerations of pity, kindness, identification with the victim, love relatedness, or a sense of fairness. Many of the archetypes that can make up the total human character manifest as pure, raw instincts of hunting, survival, aggression, territorial dominion. If they are qualified by human values, by a sense of love and moral responsibility, they are wonderful strength. If they dominate us without those other humane feelings, they reduce us to mere brutes. There is some truth and wisdom in every figure who comes to us in active imagination. Usually each brings a wisdom that we specifically need in order to compensate the one-sidedness of our egos and our habitual ways of looking at life. But the more completely an inner figure is identified with a pure archetype, the more certainly it will take a polarized viewpoint, present an extreme that is outside the bounds of ordinary humanness and common sense. The critical task that each of us has, therefore, when we take the lead of the unconscious, is to think independently and clearly. We must listen carefully to hear the truth that is hidden behind the overblown, seductive, dramatic, urgings of the inner voices. You must refine that truth to something that is more civilized, more human, more bearable. Something that can be integrated into ordinary human life without incinerating it. And toward that truth, you must find your own individual ethical stance. Step 4. The rituals. To incarnate your active imagination means to give it a physical quality, to bring it off abstract, rarefied level and to connect it to your physical, earthbound life. The fourth step of active imagination is much the same as the fourth step of dream work. This is no coincidence. We could state as a general principle that whenever you do any form of inner work and bring it to an insight or resolution, you should do something to make it concrete. Either do a physical ritual or, if appropriate, and do something that will integrate it into the fabric of your practical daily life. Since we have discussed this step in the dream work section, we will not dwell on it at length here. You might reread the chapter on rituals, review the examples you find there, and apply them to your active imagination. There is one very important point that needs to be made regarding this fourth step. You must not act out. In psychological jargon, acting out means basically taking our inner subjective conflicts and urges and trying to live them out externally and physically. In extreme clinical situation, acting out may take the form of violence directed at oneself or other people. But most of us do a certain amount of mild acting out in our daily lives without being aware of it. For example, a man gets into a terrible conflict within himself over a decision he can't stand to make. So he bursts out in anger at his wife and tries to resolve it by having a fight with her. Active imagination presents opportunities for this, because it draws up so much fantasy material. If this same man isn't careful, he is arguing with his anima during active imagination. He will go and start up the same argument with his wife immediately afterwards. He will try to live out the imagination externally and literally. To incarnate your imagination during this fourth step does not mean to act out your fantasies in a literal way. It means rather to take the essence that you have distilled from it, the meaning, insight, or basic principle that you have derived from the experience, and incarnate it by doing physical ritual or by integrating it into your practical life. You can get into trouble and cause harm if you fail to make this distinction. You must not take this fourth step of active imagination as license to act out your fantasies in their raw, literal form. When this principle comes up in extreme form, it is easy to see how true it is. For example, let's suppose that I am doing active imagination and I see myself in olden times fighting my enemies with a sword. This sword play may be a valid thing for me to do inwardly, but it is obvious that I may not incarnate this imagination by getting a sword and using it on other people I am angry with. But if the subject of the active imagination gets closer to everyday circumstances, it gets more difficult to see the distinction, and the temptation to act out the fantasy becomes stronger. For this reason, I emphasize that we should not use the images of external, physical people in active imagination. You should not call to mind the image of your spouse, your friend, or your co-worker at your job and start talking with that person in your imagination. If you do that, It puts you under extreme unconscious pressure to take up the active imagination physically when you are around that person again. You involuntarily confuse the level of imagination and level of external physical relationship. You start doing things or saying things that make no sense to other people. After all, they haven't read the script. The thing to do when the image of someone you know comes up in your imagination is to stop and change the appearance of the image. You can even do this as a part of your dialogue. You can say, "Look, I don't know why, but you look exactly like the guy at the office that I am mad at. Since I know that you are an energy system inside me, please change your appearance. I don't want to confuse what's inside me with the person who is outside of me. If you do this, the inner figure will almost always cooperate and alter his or her appearance. Then you can enter into your dialogue with a clear sense that you are talking with a part of yourself, not an external human being." There is also another reason why it is a bad idea to do active imagination using the image of someone you know in the outside world. It is that people used to call magic. It is clear from experience that we do at the unconscious level is transmitted to the unconsciousness of people around us and involuntarily affects them, even when we are not around them physically. What we do in fantasy and imagination sends out vibrations through the collective unconscious that are felt by other people in their unconscious. Therefore, if you take up a tool as powerful as active imagination and focus all energy in the unconscious on the image of a certain person, it begins to affect that individual. Even if your intentions are good, the results are simultaneously manipulative and uncomfortable. You can predict exactly what the effects will be. The other person may feel a vague, unconscious pressure and begin to behave differently toward you without understanding why. For the same reason, it is a mistake to allow yourself to fantasize a great deal about a person. In addition to being as useless as passive fantasy always is, it has a bad effect on the other person, on you, and on your relationship. If we get involuntarily caught up in recurring, intense fantasies regarding an external person, we might be angry and so fantasize telling him or her off. We might take great satisfaction in going over all sarcastic statements we will say to put the person to shame. Or we might fall in love and have a steady fantasy going in the back of the mind all day. How we will court the beloved, how things will turn out, how we will live in an exciting, passionate dream ever after. First, just as with active imagination, the running of continual fantasy through your mind regarding an external person inevitably affects the other person through the unconscious. Second, indulging in the fantasy has a bad effect on you, for it locks you into a certain mode with regard to the other person. You become conditioned through successive repetitions of the fantasy. So think about the other person in a certain way to react automatically in a certain way. And this auto-conditioning may be completely inappropriate to the objective external situation. Therefore, if you have strong inner feelings about an external person, whether they are positive or negative, it is best to begin by doing inner work to discover what is going on subjectively within yourself. Then, if you have anything that needs to be said to the other individual, it is better to say it directly, using common sense and courtesy as your guide. Don't indulge in active imagination or a stream of fantasy using the image of that person. And above all, don't act your imagination out literally. The first step of active imagination is a two-edged sword. It is a necessity, but it must not be misused or it can do more harm than good. At this stage, we need to use all the intelligence and common sense we can find within ourselves. We must do something physical, yet we may not act out, project on external people, or be impudent and demanding with others. Finally, the fourth step cannot be separated from the third step, adding the ethical element. For it is your ethical sense that must set limits and be your guide in all that you do. Levels. It is surprising that a wide range of needs are served by active imagination, once you begin to adapt it to your life. At one time, it may help you to resolve practical, everyday conflicts such as which school to send the children to or how to spend your money. At another time, you may live out the mythical journey you have stored up within you. At the far end of the spectrum, active imagination becomes a mystical, religious experience. I find that the varieties of active imagination fall into three basic levels, depending on the use that is made of it. First, horse trading. Second, embracing the unconscious. And third, experiencing the spiritual dimension. Horse trading, as I call it, is the most practical, personal level. It is the use of imagination when you need to negotiate with your inner personalities, to make those compromises and trade-offs that are sometimes required to keep practical life functioning. If horse trading seems a rather undignified name for this use of active imagination, it is because it is a somewhat undignified activity. It is a blatant process of bargaining with the inner parts of oneself so that some agreements can be reached and life can proceed. Embracing the unconscious is the level at which we actively try to bring up the uncovered parts of ourselves from the unconscious so that we can integrate them into our conscious functioning. It is the level at which we are trying to become acquainted with the unknown inner parts of ourselves. Most of the examples we have given so far are from this level. It is the primary function of active imagination, and the purpose most people have in mind when they begin. Experiencing the spiritual dimension is the level at which one is seized by a deep experience of a great archetypes. The active imagination is perceived as a vision and gives rise to religious insight. It is a rather uncommon form of active imagination, but it is experienced by many individuals and therefore it is good to be aware of it. Horse trading. Horse trading is the most practical, down-to-earth use you can make of active imagination. It begins with recognizing that you are made up of many parts, that each part of you has its own needs, its own life to live, and wants to participate in your conscious life. When you truly see this, you also begin to realize that many of the seemingly insoluble conflicts can irritate you within your day-to-day life, and are actually simple arguments between different parts of yourself who don't happen to see things alike. Sometimes when you can't arrive at synthesis between the two parts that are arguing inside you, when you can't transcend the conflict, it becomes a matter of inferior negotiations. You have to work out some kind of compromise. Sometimes people are put off by this approach to active imagination. It feels so sordid or mundane to use this high art to work out a compromise between the part of you that wants to get your work done and the part that wants to go to parties every night. But the practical fact is that there are times when the only way you can keep functioning is by doing some good, honest horse trading. At least it sets up a communication between the different parts of yourself who haven't been speaking, and eventually that communication leads to a synthesis. When I first became an analytical psychologist, I often had to work in the evening. Many of my patients worked during the day and could only come to the evening on the weekends. It was not a bad schedule, since I had my days free, but for some reason I resented it bitterly. Some inner part of me was used to having my evenings free for me, for visiting friends, socializing, music, personal life. This childish part of me was furious, and the unconscious, irrational resentment found its way into my practical life. I was irritable toward my patient. I almost forgot appointments. There are the kinds of things that happen when someone in the unconscious is absolutely opposed to what the ego has set up. I took this problem to active imagination. I looked for that part of me that was angry at my work schedule. The image that came up was a spoiled adolescent. He said, "No, I will not work in the evening. That is feeling time, that is fun time, that is human being time, and that is not work time, and that is final." So I set up a long conversation with him. I explained and explained. "Look, we have to make a living, we have to earn money, or both of us will be out on the street and hungry, you included. Since we are just starting in the profession and the only patient we have at this time are those who come in the evening or on weekends, that is the practical necessity. It has to be done." At first he wouldn't budge. I said, "Look, we have to pay the rent." And he said, "I don't give a damn about the rent. I just want to have fun. And that's what I'm going to do." I said, "But I do care about the rent." And he said, "That's tough. You go worry about that." I said, "I can't work and earn a living if you are going to sabotage everything and make me moody and resentful all the time. It affects the patients. I forget things. I put appointments in the wrong places." All of this was true. There was general chaos because such a large part of me was in rebellion against my work. Finally, I got this fellow by the throat, in my imagination, of course, and up upon the wall, and I said, "You have got to listen, or we are in bad trouble. Now, what kind of a deal can we make?" So the following horse trade developed. He agreed that if I would go to a drive-in at 10 p.m. every night and have a nice meal and take him to a movie a couple of times a week after the patients were gone, then he would keep off my back the rest of the time and let me work in peace with my patients. For many months, it worked that way. As long as I gave him his meal out and an occasional movie, he was happy and he let me work. But if I missed one evening of our meal out, this juvenile would be irritable the next day. He would make me resentful and forgetful in my work. It was incredible to me that this character had so much power over my moods and my functioning. But he did. I never admitted until many years later that I had been forced to make such a sordid, mercantile, backroom deal with my self-indulgent inner child. I felt like Faust making a pact with the devil. But in retrospect, I have come to respect these kinds of dialogues, these negotiations, these compromises between warring factions. In some ways, they are more humanely pertinent than the elevated conversations with gods and archangels. They keep the fabric of human life intact, and sometimes they lead to a consciousness that is all the more profound because it is human, earthy, and immediate. Embracing the unconscious. Most of the approaches to active imaginations are keyed to coming to terms with the unconscious by bringing the images up to the surface, reducing the negative effects of their autonomous power, making them conscious and making peace with them. We have already touched on several such approaches. The principal ones are emptying the ego mind and dialoguing with the unconscious contents that spontaneously appear, extending dreams by active imagination, dialoguing with dream figures in imagination, converting fantasy into imagination, personifying moods, feelings, and belief systems, and living through mythical journeys in active imagination. In this section, I will focus on two other excellent purposes that may be served within this second level of active imagination. I call the first one going around the walls of Jericho, the second one living in the unlived life. The walls of Jericho. The principle behind the approach I call the Wolves of Jericho is spelled out symbolically in this ancient story. Quote, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given unto thine hand Jericho, and you shall compass the city and your men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shall you do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And on the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat. And the people shall ascend up every man straight before him." End quote. This story refers to an event that must have taken place between 150,000 and 202,000 years before Christ, and was at first handed down by oral tradition. If we look at it on the symbolic level, it contains a wonderful archetypal principle, a way of approaching the seemingly impossible conflict within ourselves. In this remarkable legend, the people came up against a barrier that was absolutely impregnable. It had walls that could not have been breached or scaled by any technology then available to the tribe. But they had a prescription. They had to do a simple ritual every day of marching around the walls of Jericho. They made no direct attack, for none could have been successful. Finally, after an accumulation of these ritual marches, pealings of trumpets and shoutings, something happened. The walls fell down flat. Our inner lives often feel like journeys from one Jericho to another. We are continually coming up against obstacles within ourselves that seem like fortresses, defended with impregnable walls. Sometimes we call them autonomous complexes because they are complexes that are completely outside the influence of knowledge of the conscious mind. We only know about them through the havoc they wreak in our lives and emotions. Most of us experience conflicts at some time in life that tear us apart, that seem insoluble. We can find a path to proceed on, a place to stand, an approach that might bring a resolution. An inner problem that looks so difficult that one doesn't know where to start is an example of an inner Jericho. It is like a walled city within the unconscious, a blank spot where the unconscious mind can penetrate, something one can't even understand, much less deal with. It may be that you are hopelessly in love with someone who simply isn't available to you. Or it may be that you have a habit or pattern that you can't break, that keeps sabotaging your health, work, or relationships. The problem is within us, but we can't understand it, can't get a handle on it, can't find any direct way to approach it. In these situations, the story of the Wolves of Jericho is a symbolic prescription for a psychological process. Identify to yourself as best you can what the conflict is, what the focus of your inquiry is. Then go around that autonomous complex looking at it from every angle, powering psychological energy into it by ritual inner work, circling it like the Jericho of the story until finally the walls crumble down. The walk around Jericho can take any form, so long as you focus your energy on the walled inner city, and do your ritual. Personify the conflict by bringing up the images in your mind and talking to them. Invite the people of the city and find out who they are and why they are opposing you. Active imagination is particularly helpful for this technique of circling the walls of Jericho, but the technique is really a synthesis. The idea is to bring every form of inner work, every method in your repertoire into play. One uses every technique possible that will give some leverage, It will focus energy on the autonomous complex. One keeps it up until finally the barrier between the complex and the conscious mind is penetrated. We pull the fantasies out of the mind to deal with this problem and analyze them as symbols of what is going on deep inside. If a dream pertains, do dream work. Then extend the dream into active imagination and see where it leads. Let us say, for example, that you find yourself in a mood of depression that has beset you for days. You cannot understand it, don't know where it came from, and find yourself taking it out on innocent people around you. This depression is your inner Jericho. How do you approach it? First, personify the depression. Go into your imagination and look for the figure, the image that will represent your depression. Now begin your march around the Wolves of Jericho. Talk to your depression, march around your depression, and view it from every side. Talk to the figures who come up in active imagination and find out what they can tell you about the depression. What is it? Where did it come from? Usually, depression is balancing an inflation. But what inflation is it balancing? What do they know about it? Perhaps one of them will admit to being the one inside you who is depressed and can tell you in some detail what he or she is depressed about. In addition, to doing active imagination, we pay attention to fantasies and dreams. We write down every dream image, every fantasy image, every idea that comes into our head that seems to relate to this inner Jericho. Above all, we keep going to the inner characters day by day and talking with them. Power out your feelings. Ask for information. Ask for guidance. Offer to sacrifice the inflation, pretension, or otherworldly ideal that is compensated by the depression. Like Joshua in the legend, go around the inner walls every day. One day to active imagination. Perhaps nothing dramatic will result that day, but you have done your ritual circumambulation. You have invested your conscious energy in the complex. The next day, a strong fantasy may arise on the subject. Write it out and analyze it as you would a dream. Use the symbols to try to understand what is going on deep in the unconscious. The next morning, you may have a dream. Since you are putting so much energy into the inner Jericho, you can assume that the dream is probably on this subject. So that day, your walk around the walls of Jericho consists of dream work. Perhaps the dream will give a startling idea of what this Jericho really is. Each day, in one form or another, keep going around the walls of this autonomous complex. Eventually the walls will come down and you will begin to see what is there and what is to be done about it. The principle at work here is one of cumulative energy. One keeps investing energy, powering the energy of consciousness into this inner complex until finally it has to break. The Gordian knot falls apart. The seemingly impregnable walls fall down. The complex finally becomes penetrable by consciousness. One walks into the walled city and finds out what part of oneself lives there and why it has declared war. One requirement for this miraculous process is that we not expect instant results. Sometimes results do come amazingly quickly, but remember that you are dealing with parts of yourself that have been scaled and sealed off completely, absolutely impervious to consciousness, perhaps for years. We have to give this process time and stick with it. In the old biblical story, God introduced Joshua to march around the walls for a full 7 days. 7 symbolizes a complete cycle of inner time. The inner time required for a complete evolution of consciousness. Your experience of Jericho will require 7 inner units of time, whatever time is required for you to open up genuine consciousness of your Jericho. Outwardly, it could be 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or 7 years. One thing is certain: if you make a start and do a daily march around the walls, you will find resolution in the end. You don't have to suffer passively. You can do something. You can enlist the help of your inner strength, and you can begin to march. Miraculously, all you have to do is march. You just have to invest the energy, do the ritual, and the results come, no matter how stupid you feel, no matter how weak or incompetent you are in the face of this inner complex. You march and you march and you march, and then the wall falls. It usually happens more quickly than you expect. I have seen people begin this highly concentrated technique with heroic courage, determined to struggle for 20 years, if necessary, to overcome this insoluble problem and see if it resolved in only 3 or 4 days of intense effort. But other Jerichos may be more difficult. They are the ones embedded in the very deep places of the unconscious. They are, in a sense, life problems that stay with us for many years and are actually necessary for the growth. They make us suffer, but they give us our maturity and our individuality in return. For these life problems, the circling of the walls of Jericho is an exact prescription. If you personify the thing in your life that most afflicts you, make it your Jericho, and march around that Jericho in your active imagination. It will evolve your problem into a source of consciousness and growth. You will learn that some of our problems and obstacles are our truest friends. Our wounds turn out to be the source of our healing. Living the unlived life. One of the highest uses of active imagination is to find a level on which we may experience the unlived parts of ourselves. We are all a rich mixture of archetypes, energies, and potentialities. Some of the possibilities within us are never lived out because they look bad or inferior to us. Our egos tend to classify anything they don't understand as bad. And naturally, we avoid looking at the things in us that make us uncomfortable. But if we can find our way around our egos, prejudices, we are surprised to find that some of these unlived or repressed qualities turn out to be the finest strengths we have. Probably the main reason that we all have so many unlived lives is that there are just not enough years in a human life to experience all the possible personalities, talents, occupations, and relationships that are contained potentially within us. At some point along the way, we'll make choices. A man may feel he has the makings of a concert pianist, but he also has a talent for business, and he finds himself climbing the corporate ladders, organizing his life around the business world and supporting a family. Still, the artist in him lives on as a potentiality that he hasn't time to live externally. In the same way, a woman who chooses to be a business person may wake up one day years later and realize that some part of her always longed to stay home with the children and to be a housewife. Or she may discover a part of herself that would have chosen a religious life, the life of a nun or a life of a reclusive meditation. In active imagination, we can go to these unlived parts of ourselves and experience them in a meaningful way. It is possible to live much of life on a symbolic level, and this often satisfies that unlived part of ourselves even more than if we had lived it out externally. It seems that God and nature don't mind how we live out these potentialities within ourselves. If we live them out externally, that is good, so long as it is a conscious experience. If we live them out inwardly, on the level of symbolic experience, it often goes deeper, is more intense, and produces more consciousness. Even 10 lifetimes would not be enough time to marry all the people one has loved, follow all the occupations and interests that one might have enjoyed, or live out fully all the personalities hidden within. But if we ignore these unlived possibilities, they can go sour. They can assert themselves in clumsy ways. We may sit around feeling nostalgic about what might have been, or we can get bitter and blame bad luck or other people for denying us the chance to be heroic, rich, or famous. Whatever that other life is, you can still live it, if you will consent to do so as an inner experience. In dream and imagination, you can go to that unlived life. You can discover what it would have felt like to follow that route rather than ones you choose. You can experience both the negative and the positive sides of it in active imagination. Very likely you will discover that it wouldn't have been so much more wonderful than the life you have lived. But it is important that you experience it. For all the main energies in your total health and your total self need to be lived in some conscious way. I know a man who has a very strong religious vocation. Although he never became a priest in the church, he lives for all practical purposes like a monk. He has remained a bachelor and lives a life that is reclusive, spending his days in prayer, contemplation, meditation in the inner world. At the same time, he serves a very important function among his large extended Latin family. He carries the religious presence for them, and he is the counselor they turn to when they need wisdom from the inner world. A few years ago, a very startling thing happened to this man. He dreamed one night that he lived in Italy. He had a voluptuous Italian wife and a bunch of children living with him in a village. That in itself is not surprising, but the same dream continued the following night and for every night, day after day, week after week, for several months. Every night he returned in his dream to that same village, to his wife and family, and lived the complete life of a husband and father. He loved his wife, fought with her, took care of the children, worked hard to support them. He went to work and brought home huge bags of food in his bag to feed his hungry brood. He went through all the joys and griefs that a father goes through in living with a woman and rearing children with her. This continues, night after night, for almost a year. Into that 1 year he squeezed 20 years of family life. By day, this man was a quiet, retired bachelor living in California. By night he lived in his Italian village, spoke Italian, spanked his children, struggled with the bills, planted the garden, made love to his wife, argued with her, fought with the neighbors, went to mass with his family, took them on outings. He woke up every morning exhausted from his difficult life as a family man. This man grew accustomed to his life as a father, looked forward to seeing his children every night and having a new adventure. Then suddenly the life in his Italian village came to an end one night with this dream. I'm working so very hard again, trying to take care of my family. I'm clearing away the rubble from an old structure, a house or an ancient wall that has fallen down after many centuries. It is an old stone and clay structure, dating back to ancient times, that has collapsed. As I am working, I discover crushed under the stones a very old rose bush. It has been crushed under the fallen stones for many years, and it looks dead, even petrified. I somehow know that this is the ancient rose that grew in this land even before this village was here. It carries the life force and the promise of life and the continuity of the generations for my family and my village. I sense somehow that it is not dead, but still lives. I take it reverently and carry it to my garden. My garden is a perfect square in the courtyard surrounded by the walls of my house. Moorish style. I make a place for the rose bush at the exact center of the garden. All the people, including my wife and children, laugh at me and tell me I'm being a visionary Don Quixote again. They say the rose can't be alive after centuries, crushed beneath the rubble. But I'm sure it is alive, and I inside on planting it. I carefully prepare the soil, put the rose bush in its place, pack the soil and water it. It seems that some time passes. Then I see that the rosebush is coming to life before our eyes. It puts out green leaves, and then one perfect red rose appears. This magnificent conclusion tells us what was at stake all along, as this man lived his unlived life in the Italian village. It was the self. It was the wholeness of his being. The rose is a great symbol of the archetypal self associated in the Latin Church with both the Holy Virgin and Christ. The self is the ancient rose that blooms in the center of one's life. It was his primordial inner unity that this man brought into bloom. Within his individual soul, by living in the ancient village, living out the ancient role of the family man, bringing all the disparate parts of himself together. As you see, this man had two very strong energies flowing in him. One was his urge to be a hermit devoted to contemplation of God. The other was to be a lusty, red-blooded man with his wife, his children, and the battles that go with that life. He lived out one side of his nature during the day, in the waking world, and lived the other side just as completely at night, in the land of dreaming. The rose, in his last dream, informed him that his night life as family man has been revealed as another way of contemplating God, another path to the highest consciousness. This living of the unlived life can be done just as completely, just as perfectly, through active imagination. I once lived in a house on a cliff overlooking the ocean with a stairway down to the beach. I put on a coat and tie every morning and drove to my office in San Diego. I had a responsible position, a waiting list of patients, a nice house, good friends. I should have been completely fulfilled, or so I thought. But somewhere along the way, a fantasy started creeping into my mind from the edges of my consciousness. I would be standing outside my house and see one of the surf bums walk by fellows who spend the whole day on the beach with their surfboards and sit by campfires half the night with surfer girls. They drank beer and smoked marijuana, and so far as I could see, never put on a coat and a tie and never worked. Never had to worry about paying bills or anything else. A fantasy would suddenly jump into my head uninvited from the unconscious. If I committed some indiscretion in my profession, I could be kicked out of the church, out of my professional status as a psychologist, and could be a happy, irresponsible bum, just like those guys I see on the beach all day down there. I shoved the fantasy out of my mind. It seemed too stupid, too silly, and well, unregenerate to be taken seriously. But different versions kept coming back into my mind, so finally I decided that some part of my unconscious was trying to get recognition. And I took up the fantasy as part of my active imagination. My active imagination took two forms. Partly, it was dialogue with the beach bum inside me, and partly I went there to the beach, hung around with that crowd of young men and women, joined in at their campfires, joined their parties, their surfing, swimming, their sunlight days with nothing to do but play. My dialogue with my inner beach bum went something like this. Beach bum. Look, you live a coat and tie life. You've got it made. You give lectures, you are respected, you've got money, you have a nice house on the ocean cliffs, but you aren't as happy as I am. Robert. Well, maybe. Beach bum. Now look at all those guys and girls down on the beach all day. Secretly, you envy them. They are suntanned. They lead a completely sensuous physical life, and they don't have to balance any checkbooks. They are happy. They're really happy people. At this point, my respectable world with a professional niche and my coat and tie began to fall apart in my estimation. And the dialogue continued. It got worse. Beach bum. Now look, get yourself busted on a marijuana charge and default on your mortgage payments. And you'll get kicked out of your fancy house and you can come down and live on the beach with us and be happy. You can do all night things on the beach and sponge off people, and I'll show you how to make money off drugs, and you can be happy like us. You can see why we usually don't like to look at these possibilities in ourselves. At this point I began to answer back. Robert. But I like my house on the cliff. I like my guests who come. They wake up in the morning and there is the surf pounding and it is beautiful. I don't want to give that up. And I like my work. I like seeing what happens to people who take their analysis seriously and make a true evolution in consciousness. I like seeing the thrill that comes to people when they wake up to the inner world. So although my profession may seem stuffy at times, it is a way of experiencing something very high, very beautiful. Beach bum. But aren't you sick and tired of the patience? Aren't you sick and tired of the responsibility? Aren't you tired of listening to other people's complaints? Robert. Sometimes. But also there is something real and valuable there, and I shouldn't destroy it. And I like earning an honest living. I like having some money in the bank. Being able to help out a friend in distress, or just knowing that I don't have to worry every day about where my next meal is coming from. I want to be self-reliant. I don't want to have to sponge off someone or scrounge for my food or a roof over my head. I suppose that the historian Toynbee would say that here the two great archetypes of Western Europe were, once again, fighting it out on a primitive level within my individual soul. On the one hand, the settled landowner and townsman, putting down roots, seeking security, making a life in a stable community. On the other hand, the nomad, roaming the beaches of Salana Beach, California, instead of the steppes of Mongolia, but nevertheless roving, living by his campfire, refusing to be pinned down to a place, a job, or responsibility. I had touched something very deep in myself. A part of me wanted more than my coat and tie world. I sweated in the presence of this inner beach bum. I squirmed. I was scared. I felt I really was capable of turning into the bum I secretly wanted to be. That is the way it is with true active imagination. When you come into contact with the real part of yourself, you feel it is a threat, a menace. Your knees knock. You sweat and tremble. But you are safe because you do all this within the controlled laboratory of active imagination. You can risk what you otherwise would not dare. Confront the things that would otherwise be deadly. The end result of this active imagination was that I made peace with that beach bum inside myself. I didn't have to commit a crime and get myself kicked out of the presentable society. I didn't have to insult the establishment, cause a foreclosure on my home or alienate my friends. But I did need to see that there was an unlived life hiding within me, waiting to be lived on some appropriate level. The first appropriate level was the level of active imagination. But since then, I've discovered other levels that merged with my external physical life. I've learned that the beach bum inside me gets very happy if I take several days off and go out to a friend's cabin in the Barrega Desert. I like in the sun, wander around among the cacti and coyotes and find myself in a truer, happier Dionysian realm than I ever could have among the nomads on the beach. It is this same Dionysian, sensual, nomadic quality in me that is nourished so joyfully when I go to India. I live in a world there that is physical, made up of sunlight, sights, and sounds, and the feeling of tribal connection with the people I love. It is a more evolved, more complete vision of the potentiality I touched when I went to my inner beach bum years ago in active imagination. If you go to your inner beach bum and your inner hobo and you give him or her a chance to leave, you find eventually that this bum is really a sunyazin, a wandering mendicant holy man in disguise. And the nomadic wanderings turn out to be pilgrimages. The Washerwoman and Our Lady of Guadalupe. I propose of living an unlived life. I will recount here a legend that comes from Mexico. It is a story of one of the appearances of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the manifestation of the Holy Virgin that is most honored in Mexico. You may find it apocryphal, but if you will take it as allegory, it carries a symbolic message. Here is the story. Many long years ago, a young woman became a nun and lived in a convent. The convent was a very small and poor, and perhaps rules were not quite strict enough. Somehow a handsome young man managed to hang around the gate and catch her attention through the grill. The next evening, at Vespers, as she followed her prayers, she looked through another grill, and there he was again, looking at her with a mixture of desire and adoration. So she stopped praying. She tried, but she couldn't. After that, all she could think of was the young man, his face, his hair, his eyes. The next day she accidentally, but on purpose, found herself by the gate, and he slipped a note to her. "Be at your window at midnight. I will come for you." She could not resist. For all her sense of sin, for all her horror and at what she was doing, for all her terror of the wrath of God, she was totally in love, captivated. So she waited at the window and went down the ladder, off into the forbidden world. For a time she lived in a paradise of romance, life and sensuality. But the dream turned into a nightmare. Her lover was handsome, charming, passionate, but irresponsible. He didn't support her. He made her pregnant. Finally, he abandoned her. As years went by, her life became more miserable. She suffered illness. Her child died. She finally became a prostitute, lonely and miserable. She longed for the days of her innocence in the convent. The life she had, lost forever. After years of this, sick and aging, feeling death approaching, she decided that one thing she wanted was somehow to spend the last unworthy days of her sinful life in her beloved convent. But how? She could never tell them who she was. Finally, she went to the Mother Superior and asked for a job as a scrubwoman. She was so ravaged by time and sickness that no one in the convent recognized her. Every day she scrubbed the floors of the cells and the chapel. She was surprised by one thing. For some strange reason, no new nun had been moved into her cell. It was just the same as she had left it years before. Why? She wondered. But she was afraid to ask anyone. After many days of this hard work, which was for her a penance, she found herself on the floor of the chapel, surveying the wreckage of her life as she scrubbed the tiles. She looked up at the statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, with her flowing mantle, the color of blue night sky, and the stars shining from it. To her amazement and terror, the statue came to life. She saw the Virgin in her living form. The Virgin came down to the altar and stood by the kneeling scrub woman, who waited to be castigated and damned for eternity. Then the lady spoke. "Don't you know that I have taken your place here in the convent all these many years, waiting for your return? Every day I have taken your place in the church stall, every day taken your place at meals, and done your tasks. No one here other than I knows that you have been gone. You have never ceased to be a nun, and now you will start your life again where you left it. Now go back and take your place that I have kept for you." And so she did. If we take this legend as a symbol, it expresses a wonderful principle. Whatever life we live in our bodies, whether priest or nun, businessman or career woman, husband or wife, mother or father, professional in coat or tie or field worker in overalls, each of us has many lives that wait inside of us, wanting to somehow be lived and consciously honored. If you are a nun, you can legitimately go in active imagination to the inner world and there live through all the unlived potentialities within you. You may go down the ladder, see what the secular world is all about, and honor it for what it is. For whatever many cycles of inner time you may be there, the Virgin will take your place for you in your stall. When you come back to your cell, no one, save she will know that you have been gone. God understands these things perfectly. If you are a priest, and you need to go off inwardly and secretly, and live in an Italian village with your wife and children, and go through all the joys, sorrows, and responsibilities of that life, then that is open to you through active imagination. On the other hand, if you are one of those people who live a totally secular life, married, rearing children, or caught up in the business world, you may find a priest or a nun secretly living inside you, an important energy that has been hidden away and postponed. You may go to that inner monastery in active imagination and find a way to live out that side of your soul. If there is a great hero or heroine living there, who needs to go to a Renaissance kingdom and struggle on behalf of the queen, you will also find that part of yourself and that mystic land where it needs to live a while in active imagination. Whoever we are, our ego lives are partial systems with a huge backlog of unlived life hidden within. No matter what you have done, no matter where have you been, or what you have experienced, there is always more. Experiencing the spiritual dimension. The third level of active imagination is very similar to what people have called visions. It is difficult to talk about this level. If we are too psychological and analytical, we miss the true power and meaning of this kind of experience. But when we use the poetic and religious language that we really need to describe it, we get mixed up with our popular assumption about visions and psychic experiences. Visionary experience is an eruption of what the medieval mystics called the unity vision into one's consciousness. An image or a set of events seizes one through the imaginative faculty with such power that one really knows and experiences the unifying truth of the self. One sees for a brief time, a glimpse of the true unity, beauty, and meaning of life. When these experiences come, they always have a powerful impact. Within a day or so afterwards, perhaps one has lost the intensity of the revelation. Perhaps one is back to bickering with people and caught up in the petty things of life. But somehow the memory of these visionary experiences works on unconscious attitudes at a very deep level. Sooner or later, it brings a sense of faith that wasn't there before. A knowledge of the meaningfulness of life that had not been there before. Such experiences should not be actively thought. If you look on this as something to be pursued and accomplished, you are liable to manufacture spiritual experiences as an ego aggrandizement. Or you can be pulled off into occultism, which leads away from the consciousness, and into seeking these kinds of experiences for the thrill of the novelty of it. It is better to just do your humble inner work. When you have done enough work, invested enough energy into the unconscious, and if it is appropriate, visionary experience will come uninvited. If it doesn't come, it means that you don't need it. This is not a competition for the highest honors. But since this experience often does seize people who do regular inner work, it is good to be aware of it and be able to deal with it should it occur. The true form of this level of active imagination comes when one least expects it. It is possible to be walking down an ordinary street and suddenly find that the street, the buildings, and the people around you have been transformed into a spontaneous vision. In your vision, you may be seeing the street of life, the whole human race, the creation of God, revealed as timeless flow of time, timeless flow of life. The sidewalks and buildings do not physically change, but the active imagination erupts on the level of consciousness and produces a vision that incorporates the physical surroundings. They become representations of something that is transcendent and eternal. One of my patients was driving on the freeway early in the morning on his way to work, with the morning sun rising in the eastern sky. Suddenly he was seized by one of these experiences. The sun turned into sun wheel, with the spokes radiating out and giving birth to all the myriad forms of life and human concerns and activities. His attention was so riveted by the sun wheel in front of his eyes that he had to pull the car over and stop until the active imagination finished and he could get back into the physical world again. He knew as he looked at the sun wheel that all the separate elements of his life, all the jumble of life around him, flowed out of and back to one source. In that moment he could see that there was only unity, and that there could only be unity in all things. If you say these things, they may sound like meaningless platitudes, sentimentalities, and clichés. But when such a truths come up spontaneously from the depths of the unconscious, when one sees it as an image produced from within, one feels its truth. One no longer needs to hear it from others or to try to prove it to anyone. From one moment to another, you know from your own experience. This is perhaps the essence of the meaning of these visionary experiences, as it is really the heart of active imagination itself. It is a way of learning from your own experience, those profound truths of life that can't be transferred from one person to another with words, but can only be genuinely known through one's own connection to the collective unconscious. In this sense, we can only learn that we already know at the conscious level. Kierkegaard expressed this principle when he said that no one can give faith to another. He meant that no amount of teaching, no words, no matter how sweet the aphorisms or how rational the arguments, can communicate the experience that gives birth to faith. There is a kind of knowledge and kind of faith that only comes from experience. We have to look deeply within ourselves to find them, because they can't be experienced second-hand from other people. Each person must go directly to the source. Misunderstandings can arise when a vision is experienced not as an event in the inner imagination, but as though it were a physical event happening outside in the physical world. This was the universal experience of primitive human beings and the traditional understanding of visions in centuries gone by. People believed that some spirit or creature appeared to them from the outside. They experienced the images as though they were quasi-physical beings outside themselves. Actually, visionary experience is a form of imaginative experience, another welling up of images from the unconscious. The images are not only projected on the inner mind, but become so intense that they are projected outward and appear to be happening physically out there. After you have done active imagination for some time, if you should experience this kind of vision, you will see similarity to your active imagination and your dreaming, and you will conclude that it was an experience of active imagination in which the images appeared to you in an apparently objective way. The other form of visionary experience might be called inwardly perceived vision. One goes through the same vivid, powerful experience of images, but is aware that it is happening inwardly on the level of imagination. You are aware that you are seeing it with your mind's eye, looking within yourself. There is no confusion, because you don't have the apparitional or hallucinatory feeling that you are looking at an external physical event. An example of this would be the active imagination that I experienced with my interior lion after he appeared in my dream. At the end, the imaginative acts became visionary in their power. Yet I was aware that all this was happening inside me. Still, the immediacy, the sense of presence of the creature, and the power of the image were so strong that it was almost as though the lion were a physical thing. The Spirit Man on Mount St. Helens. I want to recount for you a visionary experience that I passed through many years ago, when I was a young man, long before I had any understanding on what these experiences are. This is the interior vision that demanded my attention uninvited, one day when I was occupied with some mundane task long years after leaving the Northwest. One evening I made a campfire on the side of Mount St. Helens, where I had spent many happy summers in childhood before the volcano erupted. I squatted on my heels looking into my campfire at dusk. Even today I can remember the vivid colors of that evening and how they thrilled me. The orange of the campfire, the dark blue color of the evening sky, the purple-gray shadows of the mountains. I felt a great sense of joy, beauty, peacefulness, but also expectancy. A young man, about my own age, came walking up and stood just on the other side of the fire. I was on my heels by the fire. He was standing quietly, and we just looked at each other for a long time. I was still in a sort of ecstasy over the colors of the fire. Then, to my astonishment, the fire moved and transported itself down into the spirit lake, way at the bottom, and burned there as tiny orange speck in the midst of that indigo blue water. Then the fire came back and burned before me. The young man took one step into the middle of the fire. He absorbed the fire into his bloodstream so that he had fire circulating in his veins rather than blood. We stood there for some time. I, looking in awe at these events, and then he said, "Come, I'm going to show you how the boards are made. Come, I'm going to show you how the world was made." We went off into space at an enormous distance until the Earth and even the solar system had become only the tiniest speck in the distance. He showed me a spiral nebula spinning. This great mass of inert, formless matter, more energy than matter, slowly spun so slowly as though there were all of eternity for it to spin through its evolutions. It spun slowly into coherence before my eyes, concentrating, reducing its volume, pulling itself together until the huge nebula was formed into a diamond. The diamond was huge, many-faceted, with its own light source within, emanating light and color that I still remember vividly. As we watched, the young man directing my gaze, the diamond began to erupt out of its north pole and absorb that flow of energy back through its south pole, so that there was a circulation of light bubbling out of the top and reabsorbing through the bottom pole. That intensified the color and the faceting of light that emanated. Then it did what would be physically impossible. It split itself down the middle and the entire system continued to rotate like a planet. The two halves began to rotate in opposite directions while still touching each other, throwing off sparks of light and color. At that time, standing somewhere with this spirit man in distant reaches of space, I did something that it embarrasses me to remember. I turned and tugged at his sleeve and said irreverently, "This is fine, but what is it good for?" I was gazing at an event of the greatest importance, but being a practical American, I had to justify it by finding a way to use it or finding some practicality in it. Again, I tugged at his sleeve and said, "What is it good for?" The spirit man looked at me in disgust. "It isn't good for anything. Just watch." That silenced me. We watched, and I felt that the colors, the light, the focusing on infinite energy and volume into a diamond-like density and brightness, were etched forever on my memory, and had almost entered into physical cells of my body. He took me back then, and I sat again on my heels before the campfire. He stood again in the fire. Then he stepped back and let the fire flow of his arteries back into the little campfire on the ground. The fire went back down to the bottom of the spirit lake and went on burning. Then the fire returned. The young man turned around without a word and walked back out into the twilight from where he had come. The vision ended, and I found myself back in my normal, mundane physical world. It is very difficult to know what to do with such a vision. I think the answer is inherent in the experience itself. Don't do anything with it. Don't try to convert it into something practical or something that makes sense to your ego mind. Just look, experience, be there. Some part of one wants to ask, but shouldn't it change something, accomplish something, have some practical application? There is no need to justify visionary experiences on any practical level. But since all facets of life flow back to one reality, we learn ultimately that they have their practical and human effects. They do change us. They form our character in very deep places. They determine what kind of people we will be in 5, 10, or 20 years after the experience. When all of its power has worked its way back to the surface and into our lives, then this magnificent power is transmuted into small things, day-to-day behavior, attitudes. The choices that we make in the ordinariness of daily human life. Jung believed that God needs human agencies to assist in the incarnation of his creation. As Thomas Mann observes in Joseph and his brothers, God needed the ladder in Jacob's dream as a way to come and go between heaven and earth. The visions of human beings make such a ladder and transmit information into the collective unconscious of humanity. No practicality beyond this is required.